Right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or evening, wherever you're joining from. It's great to see folks joining us today. I'm really excited for this discussion about seizure action plans in the context of going back to school, because it really is a time to make sure that we're starting to get all of our ducks in a row, right? To make sure that we have everything lined up so it's safe for our children to return to school. And I'm really thrilled that we get to have this conversation with two people who do this together. So we have Shawn Egan, who lives in Buffalo, New York. He and his wife Stephanie have two daughters, Harper, who has SCN2A and SCN2A mutation, and presents with epilepsy and a number of different challenges. And Shawn has over a decade of experience across many levels of drug development and works in the healthcare industry. So he sees this from different perspectives. And then Dr. Hughes, who's an associate professor of child neurology and epilepsy, and the new Epilepsy Fellowship Program Director at the University of Rochester Medical Center in Rochester, New York. So she's an active member in a lot of different bodies like the American Academy of Neurology, American Epilepsy Society, Child Neurology Society. She's linked in. She does a lot of really fantastic research. You may have seen her in some of her other webinars talking about seizure tracking and the importance of that, and how she works to use that to help her patients better care for their children and monitor. And she works with pediatric patients and has interest in ketogenic diet and does a lot of community work to help improve education for families and parents who are living with epilepsy. So we're really excited. And I think that today we're going to mostly make it a discussion and have an opportunity to hear about the relationship between a pediatric neurologist and a parent, and how that works and how that discussion morphs and over time, and how the seizure action plan is really a living document. It's not a stagnant thing that you make once and you say, now I have this tool and I'm ready to go. It's changes as often as our children change, right? So which, as we all know, is a lot. So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll start by hearing a little bit from Shawn about his experience with his daughter Harper, and and how seizure action plan is played into their care plan for school. And then Dr. Hughes can tell us a little bit about her experience in working with schools and with school communities and families. And we'd love to have you all chime in too. While we're talking, please use the chat as a way to share your experiences, your thoughts, your questions. And this is going to be conversational, so we'll weave that in as we're talking. So at this point, I'll welcome Shawn to tell us a little bit about Harper and how you guys have used seizure action plans.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. So Harper is 5 right now. She'll be 6 in February, and she started school last year. And Harper's very complex. She has seizures every day. When we were originally starting school last year, she was having infantile spasms, and that's kind of evolved into different types of focals and tonic-clonics. But school was something that we were really excited about, but it was also a huge stressor for our family. So there are a lot of boxes that we had to check before we got a level of comfort with the school and their ability to care for Harper during the day-to-day. And Dr. Hughes, who's on the line, is Harper's neurologist, and she is just incredible and brilliant and super compassionate. So she's kind of our first line of defense on trying to brainstorm ideas. And she, one of the first things that she brought up was seizure action plan. And essentially the seizure action plan is just like your roadmap that you're able to kind of bring to the school and your caregivers at the school to be able to manage your child. And Gabby was totally right. It's a living document, and even kind of the initial document from our first kind of beta version to where it ended up, by the time school was ready, it changed a lot. And then we even looked in a lot of the concepts in our original seizure action plan with our neurologist. We also layered in with kind of a roadmap with Harper's primary, her PCP as well. So we kind of have a few different documents there. But it's really important to kind of think through everything that you're doing with your child day to day. Like you end up doing like a lot of like nuanced little things to kind of either stop seizures, or, if your child's having a bad day, you kind of like layer in either like a Tylenol, or for Harper, there were periods where she was having a lot of struggles like breathing as well. So like we had like a preventative prednisone too that, prevented hospitalizations as well. And like integrating a lot of those concepts of things that you do day to day, even outside of the typical routine, that end up being meaningful for your child and keeping them out of the hospital and preventing seizures. Like you really want to layer all those into this document and make sure that it's articulated in a way that it can be acted on by the caregiver that you transition it to. But we found it to be, incredibly helpful as like an action plan, but also as like a talking off point. Harper has a nurse, a day-to-day nurse in school, but that nurse sometimes has to call off, and we have to bring in other nurses for temps for periods, and being able to get them quickly up to speed on your child. Like this is like tremendous value to be able to do that, and also remind you as a parent of, oh yeah, like we also do this here. You kind of have this internal checklist of these are the drugs that our child needs at this time of day, this is how you administer them. But there's like a lot of little things that you do that you forget about, and keeping them all housed in this document's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shawn. And I think you raise a lot of really important points that I think we should come back to, that it's not just if a child has a seizure, you do this. It's so detailed, especially for our really complex kids. It's like, how do you notice if something, if she's getting an aura, right? And if you see this coming, then do this, right? Because you can head off more seizures or a cluster, or, and we were talking even before we started, Shawn, that your family has like found a way to like maybe, comfort your daughter, and even putting things of how you can comfort a child, so that any new caregiver that steps in can really do their best in your absence. And that's what this is really about, is that you can feel comfortable handing your really complex child over to new caregivers, and they'll be able to do, no one's going to ever do as well as we do, but as best as they possibly can in that kind of situation. And I think it's really important too, that if it's not in the plan of care, they can't do it. You mentioned Tylenol. They can't just give Tylenol because they see that she's feeling a little off, right? But unless it's in the plan. So I think that kind of detail is really critical. So Dr. Hughes, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you manage seizure action plans with your patients, and why the back to school time is really a critical time to revisit this care plan that's laid out in the seizure action plan.
So I think one of the things that you mentioned is actually one of the most important. Our kids change, and they change kind of all the time. It's actually one of our first rules of complex epilepsy. Seizures are subject to change without notice, in part because they're happening in kids whose brains are actively developing and growing. And so stuff shifts when we change a new medicine or introduce a new medicine. Sometimes kids will have their, ups and downs over the course of a year, and summer might have been awesome, but after, the school start, everything kind of changes and they have a different seizure type. So that's one of the reasons why taking a moment and saying, are the things that were in last year's seizure plan still true, is fantastically important. This is our busiest time of year, and I absolutely admit that for our child neurology group, as we're specifically as a team going through everybody who's letting us know it's time to update seizure action plans, and making sure that if our kids' weights still match their rescue medicine, if the things that we had said about when it's time to swipe their VNS, is that still true now that their VNS is titrated? Has the pattern of their seizures changed so that they need rescue medicines at different times, or they need different doses of rescue medicines because of what is effective versus not effective? And then, did their signs and symptoms of seizures change? All of those are going to be really important, or whatever is their predominant seizure type. The other thing that's really important too is that those kids, absolutely, you're right, will also have shifts in how they behave in response to when a seizure is. We've had some kids who a single seizure will knock them out for the rest of the day, and they just need time and space to sleep. And then we introduce a new medicine, and now their recovery time from seizures is very different, but maybe they're going to be more unsteady, or they're going to have a different set of symptoms. And so those are a lot of the things that we're looking for when we're querying our families about what may need to be updated in a seizure action plan. And then The health status may also have changed. I have some kids who have acquired new respiratory issues. I have other kids who have outgrown their respiratory issues and now don't need as much respiratory support unless they actively get sick. And those are times when kind of each aspect of a kid's care plan should really be updated to determine kind of what needs to be next. Also, as you mentioned, if it's not in a care plan, it's not going to get given, or if it's not in an order set from a physician or from a medical group, it's not going to get given. And so making sure that Tylenol and ibuprofen doses are appropriately. If kids have respiratory action plans, or the doses of albuterol or the doses of nebs in the way that they should be, are free water flushes appropriate for their G tubes. All of those things need to be kind of assessed at this kind of beginning of the school year, and as much as possible kind of laid out in an ordered fashion. And then just for extra fun, some individual school districts have introduced their own personal forms. And then some of the specialized schools that we work with have their own specialized forms as well. So collecting those is sometimes a full-time summer job for some of our families, it feels like, so that we can help to put those things together and make sure that everything goes to the school in a way that they are willing to accept it and to use it. And so that complexity multiplied by 700 kids in the complex epilepsy program, and then another 1,000+ kids in the child neurology program, means a lot of work for our team here at U of R.
That's amazing. I mean, yeah, you guys are really kicking it into high gear at this time of year. So we're really grateful that you carved out a little time to connect with us and help share this experience, because I think it's so critically important for families to recognize the value of an updated seizure action plan. And it's not just thinking about your end, right? Like, what do we like to do? What's important to us? It's thinking about the school system that your child is in, right? Who can do what? There are state regulations, there are school regulations, school systems. I think, we always have preparation calls before these meetings. In our preparatory call, Dr. Hughes, you talked about how school systems often are very operating in fear about, like, if they do something wrong, are they liable? And this gives also them a level of comfort to say, we have permission to do this. This is what's in the best interest of the child, and we have an order to do it. And so it's safe to do.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, it also, that idea that our kids are tough. They are incredibly strong little people, and but people see them and they go, oh, this child is fragile. They're very easily broken. Anything that I do is going to disrupt them more. And no, our kids are super tough. They've already been through a lot to just get to school every day in the first place, right? And so letting people know, my kid is not going to break easily. And here's how you keep them from breaking, and they are going to be awesome. And sometimes approaching it from that strength and power of, nope, my kid's going to tell you what they need. Mm-hmm. You just need to have the rules so that when they're showing you what they need, you can give it to them.
I love that way of thinking about it, that you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You have to pay attention and then read the rules, right? Say, we're seeing this and this, what do we do? It's like you always almost need like these diagrams that they can follow. You see a fever, you see jitteriness, you do this, Yep.
And also just to know that it's a communication as well, right? So many of the schools are, oh, we'll never call the parent unless the kid is on the way to the hospital. That does not serve either of you, because so many times you can prevent a kid from ending up in the hospital by just calling and asking a question and going, I'm seeing this from your child. Is this okay? And when complexity, particularly for our SCN8A kids, our SCN2A kids, our other kids with very complex epilepsy syndromes, their okay is very different than a typical average kid who doesn't have epilepsy. And their okay can look very unusual to people who are not used to caring for kids like ours. And so knowing that, making sure that people understand what is it when a kid looks good, when they're doing okay, when they're fine, is just as important as knowing when they're not going to do okay too. Because some of our kids will have 10 seizures in a day, and that's a rockin' awesome day for them. Not our ideal and not our goal, but for them, that might be the best that's going to happen for that day, and they're going to feel great, but still have 10 seizures. And nobody needs to do anything about it. And that's unusual and a surprise if most of the time you're dealing with someone who has one seizure that sends them to the emergency room.
Right. And one thing that we talked about too in our prep meeting was what's not an emergency, right? You see something, my kid has, a lot of movement issues, and they might think, oh my gosh, that's a really long seizure. No, that's just, and so educating them on like, what is your child's baseline? What looks okay? What does okay look like? And when to not give emergency meds and not call 911, because a lot of families have dealt with that. Shawn, maybe you could tell us a little about your experience and how the seizure action plan has kind of been utilized with Harper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Dr. Hughes brought up a lot of good points. And we've kind of gone through a few of those like ebbs and flows where expectations had to be reset. When Harper first started school with a nurse, Harper was in like a period of seizure freedom, and that those are fairly rare for Harper, but a few months down the road, then seizures resumed, and we had to reset expectations. We had to educate the caregivers there on, this is a typical day now. This is Harper's going to have a tonic-clonic and maybe a few throughout the day, and that's her normal day, and that's okay. And what does it look like, and where do we draw the line in the threshold of like it's not okay? Having that constant line of communication with your care team at school is really important. And I think part of it, it's not so much on the seizure action plan, but the seizure action plan provides a platform to have these discussions is, introducing and setting expectations that it's okay to be texting us throughout the day that, that my daughter had a seizure, this is what it looked like, this is the duration, are we okay? Like to feel her out in the morning, like Harper's having a good day so far. Like that's kind of our typical day when we drop Harper off is, well, a quick line of communication to her nurse beforehand of Harper's having a good morning or a bad morning. The bad mornings are like, let's just watch and see how the next hour and a half go. If we kind of have rapid fire seizures, then maybe that's a cue that we got to go in and scoop her up for the day and bring her back home. But a lot of the times, like those days, things subside because the morning's really challenging for Harper on most days. So it's like having confidence to be able to hand Harper off even when things are, a little turmoil, because a lot of the times it'll end up being a totally fine day. And then she gets the value of having PT, OT, speech, and education all layered in throughout the day, and she loves it. But like for us, the seizure action plan, kind of the big value adds are the roadmap, empowering the care team, but then just like the platform for conversation is so huge for us. And like another component that I think we found it to be really valuable is like going to the school system of saying like, this is what Harper needs every single day. Like, do you have the capacity to accommodate this? And if not, then how do we get that level of capacity? Like this gave us a platform to say that we need a full-time nurse with Harper every day at school. And, that's been a huge value add for our family. But even when we were kind of evaluating schools like within the area, they were coming with that document and having that conversation. There were some schools that said that we couldn't provide that level of care. This isn't the right, situation in place for you. But I think it's just a really valuable document that just allows you to set expectations and have a platform for conversation.
And one of the things to keep in mind is based off of education law, which is the IDEA law, and the ADA law, and then it is section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So basically there are a series of laws that mean that even the most medically complicated kids, even those with complex epilepsy, even those with complex intellectual disability or physical disability or developmental disability, they all are supposed to be accommodated in a typical school setting. And that there are special funds available for those kids to be accommodated appropriately for the things that they need to have, to you, a free and accessible education for your children through federal schools and schooling. And so that means, though, that those monies are not suddenly available when someone appears. They're things that schools have to prepare for. And so that CSE meeting, the CPSE meeting, is an opportunity for you before the school begins for them to begin to budget for the things that your child is going to need. It also means that if situations suddenly change, schools in at least a short time may not be able to easily accommodate a change, but they should be actively working towards making sure that that change can be accommodated and can be achieved as soon as possible. And that's part of the law as well.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to remember too, is that free and appropriate education, right? That's part of section 504, is that every child is entitled to be at school and get the accommodations they need to be able to learn. And so this is not just setting mind at ease, but accessing all of those things for your child so that they can be at school. So we've got Jeffrey posed a question. Mornings are challenging for kids with epilepsy, especially if they did not sleep enough. How could we help our kids if they are also having sleeping problems because of the autism and high activity levels and, you know, so many different things, variables that come up for our kids around sleep?
So one of the toughest is often trying to build in the idea that sleep is important into everything about what you do, which means planning your schedule very far ahead of time. And particularly now, as we're going from summer schedule to school schedule, starting already now as well. So here in our area, by the way, for full disclosure, our kids don't start until September 7th. So I have a little bit of time to tell everybody this in my place. Lots of other kids have already started. But when you see those transitions coming, you begin to start to make them so that kids are not suddenly out of the blue waking up earlier or shifting their schedule. And you try to keep to those schedules as much as possible through the year so that there's not huge shifts. That's one. Two, if a child is having a lot of difficulty with sleep, sometimes they actually need both pharmacologic and behavioral management to help with that sleep pattern. And it's something that's definitely worthwhile talking with your neurologist there. Sleep medicine doctors, if you don't have that specialist as part of your team. Pediatricians are pretty well versed in how to help neurotypical kids with sleep, but sometimes our seizure medicines actually need to be shifted around because they can contribute to insomnia. Sometimes kids need medications like melatonin. Sometimes they need medications that are considered more powerful than melatonin, essentially to help them transition into sleep at the times that are necessary for their existence. And then even when you do everything right, some days are just going to have crummy sleep in them, right? It might be a seizure-filled day. They might be full of snot and puking. They're all the fun things that happen as kids just have regular kids sick. And so then building an accommodation into a child's school plan that says some days they may need to arrive late, and everybody needs to be cool with that. And everybody needs to have a plan for management of them if they do need to arrive late because they've had a rough seizure morning or a rough night of sleep. And that those absences are not necessarily absences and the kids aren't kicked out of school for the whole day because they weren't there for the morning, but that they can come in later in the day to meet what their needs are. Same idea that, hey, they're going to be gone for doctor's visits more commonly. The school can accommodate all of those ideas. They just actually need to build it in, because the more kids that are absent from school, the less money that a school gets, which is also not a very helpful situation because then more kids are absent from school more. But making sure that we're understanding some of those systems is something that can help schools to feel the school situation to feel less antagonistic. School has to balance out the fact that, hey, your kid isn't here, we have to mark them absent, with the fact that, but your kid can get there just later in the day.
I think having that open conversation with the school system, you know, your teacher and any of the caregivers there, like a lot of times they're willing to be flexible. Like we ask for like a mat because Harper has some days where she's just so sleepy, like she can't really do much. And in her kid cart, which is kind of her school wheelchair, it's just not a very comfortable place to sleep. So we asked and got mats put in the one corner of her classroom, where when Harper's having a very sleepy day, they essentially just let her sleep, and when it's her time and she's comfortable waking up, then they try to engage her then and lay her in her services then. A lot of her OTs and PTs like have like a pod of students that they kind of, I forget what they call it, but they kind of jump in periodically throughout the day. I think they have like a portion of their day that's flexible, and they kind of bounce in and try to hit some of these families throughout the day, or these kiddos that kind of are on these atypical schedules as well. But having that line of communication with the school and letting them know what your kid is like, I think is important.
And building it into the plan, right? Yeah. This is, sometimes they need to sleep, sometimes they need to recover. Yeah, that was a great question. If there's other questions, feel free to pop them in, or thoughts or questions. But I think also I appreciated that you brought up, Shawn, that it also gives you a peace of mind, right? As a parent, to be like, I'm handing over, I can feel comfort in knowing that they know what to do. So there's another question about absent seizures in the morning, because I think they're having some, but at the end, I'm not sure if it's just the lack of sleep. Please. Okay. So a little bit more about so it's about absence seizures, I guess. And those could be hard to see and for people to understand what to do.
So depending on the kid, very often we won't necessarily treat absence type seizures where the kids stop and stare, because they often don't lead to bigger convulsive seizures. They're not hurting hearts, lungs, livers, kidneys when they're happening, but they are inhibiting a kid's ability to learn, and they're interrupting what they can do. So in the greater scheme of things, if there are things like absence seizures, or you're not sure if something is a seizure or not, that's definitely something worth talking to your neurologist about so that you can figure that out. Sometimes we can only figure it out with the EEG on their head, to help us to understand if this is a seizure event versus they're just tired versus there's something going on inside their head and they're just really internally driven and internally focused, so that, you know, playing cartoons on the inside of their head, they're not necessarily going to stop and pay attention to you and interact because they're busy on the inside of their brain. I can give you the technique that we use in our clinic a lot, which is the BOOP test. So when kids are staring and zoning out because they're tired, or they're staring and zoning out because they're internally focused, a little light touch to the nose. Almost everybody who is not having a seizure is going to look at you and go, "What are you doing?" But the kind of protective mechanisms that protect your eyes and make people alert when they're tired or otherwise focused will not work when somebody's in the middle of a seizure. And so just a little light touch to the end of the nose or the bridge of the nose or the middle of the forehead is often a pretty good test for, is something a seizure versus is something not. Still within that, officially the best answer is talking to your neurologist and getting a EEG. But the BOOP test is a very benign way to figure some stuff out sometimes.
It's a great little hint there for home. Well, unless there are any other questions, I think this has been, I always learn new things too when we're talking about the kinds of information that are useful to have in the seizure action plan, how you want to use it, how you can to advocate, to have conversation starters, all those kinds of things. So I think there's not really any argument that a seizure action plan is not worthwhile having. The question is how do you do it? If your doctor is not bringing up the idea, you bring it up with them, right? And there's lots of tools that you can use to help get you started. There's templates that you can use, and it's worth kind of bringing one of those in with your doctor to get the conversation started. So while I'm pulling up a couple of resources, we do have one other question about busing and seizure action plans. I think that's a scary time, right? To put your child on a bus and then they're gone, and what happens there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Hughes.
So it really depends on where you live and the resources that are available where you live. Here in upstate New York, we have a couple of counties that are able to put some nursing on some buses, but not universally. The majority of our kids, even those traveling from particularly long distances, often travel only with an aide who has been taught to recognize their particular seizures and when an emergency is happening, almost always by a seizure action plan, or a set of parents who have been able to show them videos of seizures or to walk them and talk them through when it is an emergency. And that aide, basically their job is to watch that child or a couple of children on the bus and alert the bus driver if something is happening. And then that bus driver will pull over and call 911 and alert the bus shed so that they can also get help. And unfortunately, that's kind of the best we can do in most situations, because in New York State, we don't have a situation where bystanders like the bus aide or the bus driver are allowed to administer the seizure medication, the rescue medications. But EMS is, and so we get EMS there as soon as possible so that they are able to administer the medication that either comes with them on the ambulance or sometimes is carried back and forth with the kid. Again, unfortunately, in a county or school district specific mechanism. For the few kids that have nurses that ride the bus with them or are transported with them, then we just give orders just like we would to anyone else. But most of the time, our seizure action plan for the bus is make sure there is someone who can recognize a seizure, stop the bus and call 911. if a kid is recognized to be having a seizure that would need an intervention.
I think that's you always have to check your school district and figure out what their plans are, their rules, so it's worth, and having these discussions in your IEP meetings as well, to get clarification and alert school system to these issues as well. So they get built into not only your seizure action plan, but maybe the IEP and all these other documents that are meant to really guide the care for your child.
One of the things that's important, Gabby, is the idea that, so we talk a lot about, because almost all of our kids, of course, that are on DEE-P are kids with neurologic or developmental differences, and seizures. And so we talk about the seizure action plan as a larger document, but really what it is a care plan, and the seizure action plan is a component of it. And so if the child has other medical problems, like a heart problem or respiratory problems or GI problems, those action plans need to exist in exactly the same way that a seizure action plan does. So if the child has nausea, vomiting, what do you do? If the child has a specialized diet, like the ketogenic diet, and it's a bad day where they can't take their meals, or you're out of food or something happens, what do you do then? And so kind of each of those body systems, each of those major processes that a kid goes through needs its own action plan.
Yeah, that's a great tip, because our kids are complex and it's not just seizures we have to worry about. So making sure that school systems have all the tools they need to know your child and act on giving the best possible care. That's terrific. So if you are looking to get a seizure action plan and you don't have one already, we partner with a group called the Seizure Action Plan Coalition, which was actually founded by the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, LGS Foundation, and the Tuberous Sclerosis Complex Alliance. And they have really fantastic resources. This is a screenshot. They have resources, first aid kit, educational videos, publications, lots of rescue medication resources where you can learn about some of the newer ones that, I'm surprised at the number of people that still don't know about the nasal rescue medications that exist that are much easier to use in a school setting if they work for your child, as opposed to rectal diastat, which is kind of the standard that we've seen. Oops. And then this really helpful resource that I found on the website and that they're promoting is this back to school, their kids backpack, your back to school checklist. Make sure that you do all of these things to make sure that your child is ready to go back to school, that you have an updated seizure action plan, meeting with school staff, making sure they understand and recognize what your child looks like when having a good day, a bad day. School medication forms is another whole, hoop to jump through. And then, of course, sharing as many resources as possible. I mean, I think a lot of times what we do also is share videos, right? This is what a seizure looks like. If you see this, this is what a seizure is. If you see this, this is not a seizure. So thinking about the kind of tools that you can hand over to school to really help them get a sense of who your child is and what their needs are. So, and you can get all of this at seizureactionplans.org. So it's a great resource. It's on our website. If you go onto the Deep Connections website, you'll see it. The series that we've been working on, we had a summer series. We worked with Dr. Hughes on as well. And then this one of getting ready back to school, we've worked on with support from Neurology. And so we're grateful to them for that. And I think, I wanted to do a quick shout out also that we are doing some research on COVID-19 and the DEE. So if you are willing to it takes less than 10 minutes to get on and just share your experiences with either vaccinations, whether you decide to vaccinate or not, and any adverse side effects, side effects from vaccinations, if you did see any, and if your child has been infected, how that worked out for them, what happened. We don't know because there's not really any good research. So we are crowdsourcing from the community to learn from you all about what's happened with your child and COVID. So we really appreciate anyone taking the time to do that. And thank you for joining us. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much to Dr. Hughes and Shawn for joining us for this discussion. always really incredible to hear from a team who are working together too. I just love this dynamic of actually a provider and the person that they're working with on the family end, and kind of how they do that back and forth. So we're grateful to have had you with us. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, and be on the lookout for more upcoming webinars. We've got one on dental care for children who don't eat by mouth coming up, and what that looks like. We've got some others on the ketogenic diet, both in English and in Spanish. We're trying to do more Spanish language webinars. So check out our website at deepconnections.net and tell us what you'd like to hear more about if there's topics you want to hear. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy the last days of summer if you still have any, and we'll see you in the fall. Take care.